So I'd like to thank Keith and Kevin and Junior and just for bringing me into this project and for trusting me and just kind of letting me sort of try and craft the story here. Just out of curiosity, by show of hands, how many people here are part of the Tobin family? A lot, okay. There were many weeks I spent more time with your family than with mine. No, it's great to be here, and I can see Tom in person. We've spent a lot of hours going over each other and tests, so anyway, thanks for that.
Yeah, just a question about that. Like, how do you take such a large amount of quantity of material and try to whittle it to quality while still telling the same story, knowing what you're leaving out?
There are two ways of answering this. First, if you're involved in the project from the beginning and you're part of shaping that story, you can do things to control the narrative. In other words, is this working?
I think so.
Hello? Okay. I don't know that it needs to be quite that loud, but it'll help a little bit. So if you're involved in the project from the beginning, like I said, you can help shape the narrative. You don't want to change the story that someone's telling, but there are certain circumstances where you know the soundbite you need. You need somebody to say something, so you just have to sometimes ask different questions. But that wasn't the case here, because I came in later in the project, and so all the interviews had already been shot. When you do an interview and then you edit the interview, oftentimes there are breaks and there are transitions, and so it's nice to have other footage being cut away to help
the viewer occupied, so to speak, for a few moments.
Right. So in this scenario, because I was brought in later in the process, it was different. And so I just had to sort of take all of this material and then, I should say, even in the first situation, you never really end up with a story that you intend to tell. Things change over time, and based on what people say, you learn from people, and then you end up sometimes with, I would say usually with a story that's way better than the one that you intended to make, because people tell you things that are fascinating all the time. Well, in this situation, and sorry if I'm a little bit all over the place, but I just had to go through all of this footage and then figure out, not just the interviews with Tess and Tom, but also with Michael and Malika. And as Keith said before the film started, part of the grant was to incorporate these contemporary veterans into the conversation. And I think that's something we struggled with in the beginning, figuring out how to make this one cohesive story that includes not just the Tobin family, but also, Thomas Michael Tobin, but also, I think, Tess and Tom are characters, not characters, but they're part of the story.
The music that you heard in the film was actually all done by Timothy himself, and he threw in little touches there, like where you see like Wilson, talking about Wilson in France. He threw in a little bit of French music.
I don't know. The music thing just kind of happened incidentally. Like you said, we were having we didn't want to face any additional hurdles with copyright issues or anything of that nature, and it just seemed easier to me to just do the music than to right, yeah. And it also, you kind of know the mood of the film you're making. It's sometimes easier to just, if you can, if you have the capacity, rather than trying to find the perfect thing, just kind of like write something that goes along with something. And to the extent that that's succeeded or failed, I'm not going to judge that. But anyway, that was a fun aspect of it. But just to go back to the last question, I suppose, I'm not sure I really answered that one properly, but one thing that we found that was in common, everyone that we had interviewed or that had been interviewed was not only from New York, but had, for the most part, served in a non-combat role in the respective wars that they had fought in. when you think of war, you think of the atrocities. It's so underrepresented, the people who fight in these or serve in non-combat roles, and that sort of became an important part of the story. I think, to answer your question, Anthony, I think that was kind of like one of the main threads that helped, carry that story arc along. If that makes any sense, I don't know.
Also, another thing that's interesting, one thing that Tim really brought to the table is that in addition to being a musician, he's also, a novelist, and been working on a project, and know that you taught English at Brooklyn College for a while before changing careers, and some of your biggest influences are Hemingway and James Joyce, and so you have a very strong sense of narrative drive, and maybe just tell us maybe a little bit about like the narrative, if you will, like maybe you've already answered that in the sense that like you tried to like find the threads between the three soldiers, but did you find it difficult, like with the narrative drive, like that?
Well, at first I did. It was difficult to, because having come into the project after it had already been, the interviews had already been shot, all the questions had been asked, and I wasn't really a part of that sort of pre-production and interview process. I had a grasp of the story that they wanted to tell. But there was there came a time when I realized that the story that they wanted to tell couldn't be told in entirety with the existing interview material, and so you have to work with what you have. And so at that point, then you just sort of have to get creative. You tell the story, but you also and it's interesting. Part of the solution to this, Keith made it into the film as one of the interviewees as a way of solving some of these problems, because to help tie the Michael and Malika stories together with the Thomas Michael Tobin story, there were links that were missing that I didn't think could really be solved adequately with the narration. And so we decided to interview Keith, and that provided some of the segues and some of the transitions that we needed in order to help make those stories feel like perhaps they might belong together, in part because that's what the grant had demanded, but also because it would just seem as though there were two different documentaries. And so I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but part of the... Does that answer the question? Okay.